So we have 3 people on our panel today that I will briefly introduce you to. The first person you see here is Trent Sharp. Trent is a colleague of mine at AIR. He's a senior TA consultant in our Boston office. He's a former teacher and principal, and I think many of you know him. So he has worked with a lot of different states to use GIS as a tool. So we'll hear a little bit more from him about those experiences. Our second panelist is Hannah Goldberg. So welcome, Hannah. Thanks for joining us. Hannah is the Director of Research at GIS, which is the Georgia Early Education Alliance for Ready Students here in Atlanta. She's a former educator and now researcher with expertise in early language and literacy development, program evaluation, and as you'll see, use of lots of data and maps to visualize information. And then finally, we welcome Danielle Ewan. So she's a senior policy advisor at Education Council in Washington, D.C., and you met her yesterday on the panel. She was previously director of early childhood education in D.C. public schools, and we welcome her expertise on early childhood systems and data as well. So we plan on this being a pretty conversational session, so please feel free to ask questions as you have them. We'll also have time for questions at the end. So we'll start with each of our panelists giving a presentation, a very brief presentation, and sharing some thoughts, and then we'll have some questions pre-prepared, and then we'll welcome your questions. So we'll start with Danielle.
Hi everybody, can you hear me? How are we doing?
Is it on?
Is this on?
Yes.
No, it is, great. So I'm a little bit of the outlier on this panel because I am not going to show you data or give you really deep expertise on how to use GIS mapping data to answer all of your burning questions. My 2 wonderful colleagues are going to do that. But I was asked to be on the panel to sort of set the stage about early childhood and data and why it's really important to have this conversation at this time in this room. And how many of you find yourselves drowning in data every day? Raise your hand. About half the room. How much of that data is about kids before they walk through the school door? Anybody want to pop up with an answer? A little bit. Raise your hand if it's a little. Raise your hand if you look at data about children before they walk through the school door every day. Hannah, raise your hand. Now you know why she's up here. So that's exactly the point. I don't know if you all were looking around your colleagues, but departments of education, school districts, school district leaders often don't have data and information about kids who are not directly impacted on a day-to-day basis by the K-12 system. And yet, cliche coming, they're the same kids, and they're our kids, right? And so as we're implementing all of these changes in the ed reform space, as we're thinking about your strategic plans that you've all written behind your ESSA plans, as you've written your ESSA plans, as you've written your plans to implement IDEA, as you've written your plan to insert federal dollars here, you need to be thinking about what those kids are experiencing before they walk through the school door. And so we're going to have a panel to encourage you to think about that. So let me set the stage. In the state departments of ed, where early childhood comes into contact with the K-12 system is often through either state-funded pre-K, right, or your special ed program, or some other small boutique program that is targeted at a particular group of kids. But outside of that, and we've talked about this in some of the other sessions, there's this whole early childhood system, and I use the word system very, very, very lightly, where kids are dropped off because parents have to go to work. They're left there for 10, 12 hours a day. They start as early as 6 weeks in some communities, depending on what parents have available to them. And they go to that child care center until they go to school in many cases. Through the years in those child care centers, some of them get high quality, nurturing care that supports the full range of their developmental domains, and some of them are simply kept safe. Some of them are in licensed care, where they're in a center or with a family home provider every day, and some of them are in care where nobody sees them. They're with a nanny, they're with a relative, they're with a provider that's only serving a low number of kids. And so what that means is that there's this whole group of kids that are going to be your kindergarten class or your first grade class, about whom we need to know what they've experienced, where they've been, their family situations, any interventions they've already had, interventions they might need, whether they've had developmental screenings, whether they have a medical home, and so on and so forth, because it impacts whether and how they will be successful when they walk through that school door. And schools and school districts and state departments of education are starting to figure out how to take on this data need and to understand those systems and to take out the parts of those systems that are going to be relevant to, as the kids walk through the door. And so what we're going to talk about today are some ways to marry those two systems, to think about data, and to think about how to enter into the conversation to get the information you need. You've heard a couple of ways throughout the conference so far. We had a great presentation yesterday about the needs assessments that are required in different parts of ESSA, particularly for those schools that are put into your school improvement category. And I would argue that a key component of those needs assessments should be a landscape analysis of what kids experience before they walk through the door. What kind of quality did they have? How many kids are there in the cohort? What is their racial and ethnic breakdown? What is their income grouping? What access to Head Start did they have? What kind of teachers did they have in their child care programs? All of those things so that you start to have a picture of what kids experienced, which will help drive the kind of interventions. So let me make that a little bit more concrete for you. If what you know is that a school has been put into improvement because their English language scores on your accountability system are very, very low, and you find out that the vast majority of kids have been in child care where there's little academic focus, where there are no numbers and letters shared, where teachers have no training in how to build pre-literacy skills, there's a pretty clear intervention that the school improvement system, the school improvement process can offer to the community. Can we train the early childhood teachers in pre-literacy skills? Can we help provide an assessment at 3 and 4 to identify kids who might be behind? Can we think about how to better arrange our early intervention system so that we're identifying kids earlier, right? So you start to understand where the gaps are and to see the needs. This isn't about trying to understand every child's experience and identify every child's need. It's about understanding cohorts and neighborhoods and using data to develop the systemic approaches to better support those kids and families. So I will stop there and let you all go.
So just to give you a little bit of context, I work for an organization called GEARS, as Karen mentioned. GEARS is the Georgia Early Education Alliance for Ready Students. We are a statewide policy advocacy and research organization that works in the early childhood space. And over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, we've developed, through consultation with many of our wonderful partners, what's now become a suite of data and mapping tools. And you can see some of them here. And on another day, or if you'd like to call me, I'm happy to sort of walk you through some more of the details and show you how this has been used. I know some of my Georgia colleagues are here, but perhaps have a conversation about how you might replicate something similar in your own states. But we realized pretty early on, we spent a lot of time in our organization and with our partners talking about school readiness. And what we have known now for some time, and more folks are coming to understand, is that school readiness is comprehensive. And we can't talk about school readiness using a single indicator, like, for example, third grade reading. And so to really understand what is going on at the community level, and to treat school readiness as the sort of comprehensive construct that it is, you really need to know more. You need to know more about children starting from birth. You need to know about the communities in which they live. You need to know about the adults who live in that community. You need to know where community resources are located. And so we have, it has been a real labor of love, developed a series of tools. And you can sort of see from the slide in front of you that they actually operate at different geographies. So we started with a tool that was, and for the most part these are statewide tools. We started with a tool that was county level. For those of you who don't know, Georgia has 159 counties, which I believe is second only to Texas. And we were, our first tool that you see in the top left corner there is the GEARS blueprint. And if it looks a little overwhelming, it's because it does a whole lot of different exciting things. In my mind, we have data sources, probably, over 100 different variables that you can explore. You can change the base layer, so the county level in this case to reflect, for example, the percentage of children under 5 living in poverty, or percentage of births to mothers without a high school diploma. We were fortunate enough to be able to develop data sharing agreements with a number of our state agency partners. So we have data, in Georgia we have a standalone Department of Early Care and Learning, so we have data from DCAL, we have data from DOE, we have data from DPH, DFACS, I'm probably missing
Family and Children's Services.
Yes. So we have a lot. I mean, this tool houses a whole lot of data, and it lets folks really understand the complexity of what's going on, in this case, at the county level. And what you see on top, those dots represent different kinds of assets. So this is, in many cases, might be an early learning provider. We have it broken down by Georgia pre-K and quality rated providers. You heard Danielle talk about the importance and the difference between licensed and sometimes underground childcare, and those providers that are participating and have demonstrated a commitment to quality. There's a scatter plot, so you can plot variables against one another. This is really a comprehensive tool that lets you understand what is going on, again, not just in 3rd grade, but well before 3rd grade, and how all of those factors are interacting to really provide a more comprehensive view of what, yes?
How often is your data updated?
That's a great question. It depends on the data source. We have updates scheduled for this tool 3 times a year. For some of our point level data, so for example, I mentioned Georgia's quality rating and improvement system is called Quality Rated. We have a relatively young QRIS, and so that landscape is changing rapidly. So we have set up with DCAL a live feed so that when you go to our tool, you're seeing in real time whether a program is participating and what their star rating is. So it depends on the source, but yeah, we have updates, scheduled updates 3 to 4 times a year to that tool if it's not a live feed. That wasn't easy. But we felt that it was important to be reflecting the current landscape and to make sure our partners were using tools that were relevant and accurate. Yes?
What challenges did you face with getting the data sharing agreements between the agencies?
That's a great question.
That's a loaded question.
Terry's in charge of her State Department of Education.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good context. We actually are very fortunate for the most part. We have really wonderful relationships with most of our state agency partners. I will say it gets, depending on the type of data you're looking for, it can be tricky. So I'll provide one example. Our Division of Family and Children's Services keeps child abuse and neglect data. It was really important to us to be able to include that information on our tools, but what I was going to mention in just a few minutes is that we actually transitioned and added a census tract level tool. That's very sensitive data, so we've continued to struggle to get the data in a way that can be interpreted, but is not releasing overly sensitive information. But I will say, with that one piece aside, we've had really great luck with our partners. A lot of this information is publicly available information, but because our partners at the various state agencies understand that this is really a collective effort and not the effort of a single organization or agency, we've had pretty good luck getting that available. But I know that's not always going to be the case in every state. Is that helpful?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, you can see that our tools continue to evolve based on conversations that we are having with many of our partners, and particularly our community partners. So I mentioned our original tool was a county level tool. Those of you who know Georgia, I'll use Fulton County as an example. Fulton County is a very long, skinny, funny looking county that looks very different in different areas of the county. And because so many of our partners are involved in place-based work, and if you think about local school systems, for example, neighborhood initiatives, it wasn't getting us there. And so we knew that we needed to develop a slightly different tool. The trade-off is you don't get quite as much data, at the census tract level. But this has been an incredible tool that we sort of streamlined a little bit to simplify the process, because the first one is a little overwhelming for some users. And we launched this tool probably within the last year and are continuing to revise it. But it has been an important conversation starter and jumping off point for a lot of our community partners to begin to explore what's going on, not just in their county, but in their neighborhood. And then finally, I'll also just mention our most recent initiative in coordination with the Reinvestment Fund. They're based in Philadelphia. They have developed child care maps in several municipalities and received funding to replicate their effort, and came to us and said, we want to try to do this in Metro Atlanta. And this is taking the analysis just one step further. They're actually attempting to model the supply, demand, and shortage of childcare, and this is at the block group level. So you can see that the different tools sort of serve different purposes and function at different levels of geography, but together can really paint a pretty good picture for a number of different partners, whether it's a school system partner or a state agency partner or some of our community organizations, to really understand where the success stories are, but also to sort of highlight those areas of need and to help them develop plans and write grants, and ultimately better serve the children who are living in those communities. Yes?
One more. Is this a public site? Who can access it?
Yes, this is a publicly available tool. You can find it at our website if you go to gears.org, and that was intentional. We want folks to use this tool. We want them to have a conversation and ask us questions, and really think about the data in a different way. And before I turn it over, I just want to underscore, this is very different than looking at a spreadsheet, and I think it tells a different story. It is certainly more nuanced, and in many times, I will say that I know this scares some people because it seems overwhelming, and it's perhaps not always as straightforward as looking at something on a spreadsheet, but it's really changed the conversations that we know so many of our partners are having.
And Hannah, how has it let you talk to your state legislators?
That's a great question. So I will tell you that most of our legislators do not want to play around with these tools, which is why we developed profiles. And if you see in the top right corner, we have profiles for all of the counties in Georgia as well as the city of Atlanta. And depending on the audience, legislators are a great example. This is the right conversation starter, not a 30-minute tutorial on how to use this data tool. I will say that we have congressional district overlays and state house and senate overlays, which is very helpful perhaps to a staffer, but the profiles have been really helpful in that regard. Yes?
Who funds your organization?
That's a good question. The Goizueta Foundation, which is based in Metro Atlanta, has funded most of our mapping work. In the case of Reinvestment Fund, they approached us. They were funded by national organizations to replicate their work, but the work that you're seeing here is funded by the Goizueta Foundation. We are almost exclusively supported by foundations like yours.
Hi. So before I describe the work, I thought it'd be useful just to tell very quickly both a personal and a very practical reason that we ended up getting into this work in the first place. I'm a recovering principal of a public school in Denver, Colorado, where we've gone through a process of closing the most chronically low-performing high school in the state. And as we began the process of doing a terrible job engaging community and then beginning to work with families and the more you're immersed in a particular context, I'm telling you everything you know already, you begin to see the real true ways that stress and distress and kind of chronic crisis for children when they are growing up before they arrive in the school space, you get to feel how those pieces come together. So whether it was, the kids who would cry every time it was about to snow because their dads were roofers, and if their dads were roofers, then they couldn't be on the roof when it was snowing, so that meant that they didn't eat for a while. And so the ways, these are things if you have been a practitioner, then you are intimately aware of the ways that multiple systems come together in particular places to make life so much harder. You're walking up the down escalator. These kids have got to overcome so much more just to be in a space to be able to engage content, to be able to participate with their peers, etc. etc. And so all of this work really comes out of this very grounded space in an acknowledgement that if we are authentically wanting to change the systems we work in, then if we continue to work in silos, education silos, we will fail over and over again. It's not going to work. Nothing we do within the K-12 system or with early childhood in isolation in itself will be sufficient to dismantle and address these issues with those levels of complexity. So that's a personal reason for it. The practical reason is actually from my work with AIR. I work with state education agencies, mostly. And working with Texas, we were having a conversation we sat for 3 hours with a set of spreadsheets talking about which districts we were likely going to go work with, and they say, well, I've got a relationship with these 5. These are the ones who will call me back. These are the ones who won't hang up on me. These are the ones who, who I can actually get a return phone call from a superintendent. And so we posed the question, we said, well, are these the same districts you kind of always work with? They're like, yeah, anytime we have, incoming funding, there's kind of a usual suspects that we end up engaging with because politics, relationships, etc. And so the whole kind of decision-making process was based on entirely wrong-minded data. And so we basically posed the question, we said, where should we be doing work, and what kind of work should we be doing? And so through that process, we started a project where we worked with the Texas Education Agency to bring in all the publicly available census data and demographic data. And so this is free stuff. Any of you right now can log on and get it. And we began layering in thinking about stress and distress for kids. So we wanted to think about vulnerability, and Hannah just listed 10 of the topics. It's like, where do you have the high concentrations of babies under 5 living in poverty with single mothers and high unemployment, et cetera. And so you can create this landscape pretty quick that gives you a very clear sense about how physical space is racialized, and it's highly segmented and segregated based on race and class. And we all know that, right? And everybody's kind of intuitive about it, but it has this different kind of emotional pop once you have to stare at it in the face. And so we began to overlay our school performance data on top of those indicators. And when we did, we noticed something very, very interesting, which was that our kind of superficial administrative boundaries, we've got school districts, we've got education service centers, there's 20 of those. And those are kind of these two main systems that the state uses to try to deploy resources and to deploy supports. And once we began looking at the data, we said, well, in your big urbans, this kind of breaks down, because in a particular city limits, you could have 14 school districts and 12 charter providers, and none of them are doing good. And so we need a different kind of approach here. This is an approach where we need to be able to have a regional metropolitan set of interventions to be able to support people in these places in a different kind of way. For our rural schools, frequently we would see the educational service centers would kind of intersect out in the middle of nowhere. So if you're imagining Texas, there's a lot of nowhere. It's terrible. But it's just, it's out in space, and there'd be these large clusters of low-performing schools that were sitting at the intersections of these superficial ESC boundaries. And so we began to ask, we're like, is this the right tool for the job? How do we need to be thinking differently if we forgot everything we knew about the shape of school districts and education service centers and only focused on equity? How would it change the tools we use? And so that became this powerful conversation. What became very clear very fast is that we needed to bring in more people. And so the school improvement division was insufficient. We needed to be able to work with our partners in special education. We needed early childhood. We needed career and technology ed. At least within the agency, we needed more people around the table to address the problem. And so that really is this other point around this work, is that the maps in some way are kind of the easy part. but they're highly emotional, and the bigger challenge is getting the people around the maps. It's the adaptive challenge of how do we all walk in and look at the honesty that this map shines back in your face, because what you're begin to see, this is Cleveland, what you begin to see is the highly racialized geographies, highly class-based geographies of our nation's history, and you have to really look it in the face in this in a way that a spreadsheet never evokes this response. But here we say, no, we need to be thinking in terms of particular streets, of particular children walking through particular places before they come to particular schools. And so this is from some work we did with Cleveland on some of their safety, health and well-being surveys that they've conducted for over a decade. And we were curious, where are babies basically getting to school, or on their trips to school, where do they feel unsafe? And so the big red orange dots were places to where you had statistically significant large groups of kids saying they didn't feel safe. And so it gets this pretty clear pattern on the east side of Cleveland. But the additional layer that really got us thinking were so many of our orange dot schools are situated next to these little neon blue rings that you see up here. And those are housing projects. Mm-hmm. And so it became this kind of structural opportunity. It was like, listen, that's the moment. And I think you all mentioned earlier kind of the imperative around engaging partnerships, et cetera. And whenever you have low-hanging fruit, to be able to take it. This was a moment where, so we have a lot of kids who are not feeling safe getting to school or being in school. How can these schools be working together in partnership with the housing authority to create a different kind of space? But you can't see that on a spreadsheet. You need to be able to look it in the face and look at particular neighborhoods. So from Texas, we ended up, a lot of people heard about it, and we've now done work with California and Michigan and Colorado and Georgia, and there's a whole 14 states that we've worked with. The way we do that work is actually through your comprehensive center. So Beth, thank you for hosting this, but this is part of the way that state agencies can access, if you don't have a GEARS, and if you have a GEARS, lucky you. But if you don't have a GEARS,
you can have a Trent.
Yeah, I wanted to share a few ways to kind of access this, because I've gotten to implement this with a number of states, and it's been, you kind of take a different approach in every place because you all are different. But if you don't have a GEARS, many of you may be sitting there going, yeah, but that's not going to work, or we can't do that in our state. And one of the surprises we had was we would always find a GIS guy, and it was usually a guy, and he'd usually have an office in the basement, and they really don't use them very much. They use GIS for boundaries. Mm-hmm. And so it's very administrative, and so frequently it would be in your operations department where the GIS skill set would be. And so part of what we needed to do was we would re-engage these people, and they would be elated because it was like their work really mattered in a different kind of way. But being able to get your research and evaluation departments linked up with your technicians to where you're taking your data scientists along with your practitioners and along with your technical expertise in operations to be able to create, that's the only ingredients you needed if you have that available to you to get that done. And so we've worked with several states on just, let's build that team and build that relationship and get that team up and running based on resources you already have. I'd also say just local practitioners and partners both. So like GEARS is a great example of just there are multiple people in almost every big urban community or state agency. Your state demographers are really, I know ours in Texas is like very personable, and you can kind of walk in his room and say, hey, I've got this thing I'm trying to figure out, and he geeks out and wants to go do it for you. Or he's got a grad student who can do it, which that would be another one that we've really found is community colleges frequently will have GIS department. So it's a really nice associate's degree to get, and typically we've actually worked with the United Way in Austin where they've mapped 311 data, which, do you guys know about 311 data? You should know about this. So here's what 311 data is. It's like 911, but you call it when you need supports and services. So it's like for bills or for getting your electricity turned back on or getting referrals for health. But this stuff is live, and they collect the data by zip code. And
in the states that have it.
In the states that have it, yeah. And so United Way is a cool resource there. But that was a place where United Way had engaged a set of community college partners. And they did some really nice work based on the research question that they were trying to attend to. And then the last one I would share, just very practically, since you all are in state agencies, and all of you have a comprehensive center that is in some way tangentially connected to our work at AIR, is I've got a full division that does this stuff now, and so being able to access through your comprehensive center, you can actually engage our team and we can have a set of conversations. And in California, we're actually doing that now as well. So you all's comprehensive center is not one of ours, but we're actually working with you guys as well on that. So there's just a lot of different ways to, if you're wanting to incorporate this into your practice and decision making, there's a lot of ways to do it, and a lot of different states have done it. So that's all. Yes, ma'am.
So is there a cost involved with this? I mean, other than, I get the time element, but is there a cost involved?
She calls yes.
So yeah, not for the state agency. So Mississippi's in SECC. So part of what this does is when Beth and team are building out their plan for their budget, part of what they budget is support for Mississippi to go do that kind of work. And so that's what frees up my team to be able to come meet with your team. We've had conversations with Georgia like that. We're kind of pending on having that combo, but that's kind of, I knew nothing about the comprehensive centers before I came here, but I really think they're kind of, it's an underutilized lever from state agencies to be able to access great resources there.
So is there a certain cost that goes into the GIS system itself, or the technology or the software or the...
Yeah, and what we've actually, I don't know of any state we've worked with already that hasn't
had something to start with.
They've already had licenses, and many times they had, like in Texas, we had 30 licenses and only one of them was being used. And it was just, yeah, they're leftover. Also, as state agencies, you get a nonprofit rate, which is $100 a license. So they're cheap. And that's for the very advanced version, which you really only need that if you do it as your job.
Thank you for the practical advice on that matter. And I think that you guys have also on the panel really made the case for the importance of this data and looking at data before kindergarten and what's going on in our communities for our children in their families and communities before they arrive at kindergarten. And you've also made the case, I think, really well for GIS, for visualizing this data, for seeing the patterns, and for really making that pop. So I have a question for all of you, but we'll start with Hannah. How has presenting this kind of information in GIS changed the conversation among districts, among states, among policymakers? How has it changed the conversation?
Probably easiest to provide an example, because the conversations that we have with our partners vary. You know, we're having a different conversation with a United Way than we are with the local school system. But I'll provide one very recent and concrete example. In Georgia, we have 60% of our 4-year-olds are served through Georgia's pre-K program. And we have a mixed delivery system where about half of those kids are served through local school systems and half are served in private childcare. And there's been, as you know, a lot of interest in expanding early learning options. And just because half of our kids are served in local school systems does not mean that every school system in the state of Georgia offers pre-K, in part because the private market is doing a decent job in some cases of serving that population. But we were contacted by a very eager school system that had their board's seal of approval to start offering early learning. And they are looking into opening an early learning center where they would be serving not only 4-year-olds but 3-year-olds as well. And we use these tools to sort of help them put on the brakes just a little bit and to help them understand the existing context and where those programs already existed, because that's not always on their mind. They think that there's a need, but using this, again, it's very different than looking at a spreadsheet. I can send them a spreadsheet of all of the private child care providers in their attendance zone, but looking at it and being able to visualize that data is very, very different. And so I think we've been able to have much more informed conversations with many of our school system partners because they're able to understand, again, that context and not just where those programs are located, but more information about the kids that are coming to them, which in many cases look different than the kids, depending on the area, than the kids they've been serving historically. So I think that's one example. But again, we've used these tools very differently with different partners, and I think that reflects the diversity of our current suite of tools because we've tried to adapt to the needs of our partners to provide them with something that can be useful to them.
Question?
Yes.
I heard you mention the United Way. Have
Yes.
you worked with any of the campaigns for grade level reading?
We have. We're a partner with the Grade Level Reading Campaign. In fact, the Grade Level Reading Campaign has its own tool, Get Georgia Reading, which, again, the focus is a little bit more refined in that case, but there are a lot of similarities between our tools, and we've worked with many of the same partners. Mm-hmm.
And Trent, how would you say the conversation has changed at the state level?
I'll bring, here's one way it has and one way it hasn't. Then the one way it has, kind of in addition to what Hannah said, is what's been surprising is finding positive, we would call them like positive deviants. And so like in Texas, we had this huge cluster of high-performing, high-growth Title I schools in the Rio Grande Valley. And it's this knot of schools that were doing great. And it was a reminder about how negative of a mindset we get in frequently when we're trying to improve systems. So it really turned our eye towards what are our strengths actually, and how can we be doing a better job of leveraging our strengths to inform places where we need support. So that's been a big one where it has not shifted, and this is a soapbox for me in some ways, but it allows more precision for kind of how you identify in places where you need to engage. But if we continue to do projects to places instead of with places, we haven't won anything. And so really what GIS points your nose towards is this is an opportunity to go and engage and participate with a community in transformation, and it's really mixed methods research, right? Use a quantitative lens to be able to identify a place, and then really it should be participatory transformation because they're the ones who are going to have to live with it and implement, and it's their lives and their streets and their communities, and so shifting that kind of typical state agency behavior is still the behavior to change, right? I think what it does is the agencies are really walking in with way more context than before. Than just being a spreadsheet, you're really thinking more in terms of humans and putting a human face in the middle of a system that's really dehumanized, I think, a lot of schools and districts.
What are some things to keep in mind when we're using GIS to present information with stakeholders, different kinds of stakeholders?
So I think the point Trent just made is the most important one, that the value of GIS is it gives you something to look at that isn't just numbers on a page and that brings to mind the children and families that we're talking about. I think the other thing that it does is it helps us bring together the various different systems. You've heard all of us say that we weren't just looking at one piece of data about kids and outcomes. We're looking at health, we're looking at housing, we're looking at demographics around income and family circumstances. And when you start to do that, you have radically different conversations than you have when you're just talking to folks about how do we raise our test scores in third grade. You start understanding things like food deserts and book deserts, right? You start understanding that kids that don't live in a place where they ever see a book might really need different interventions than kids who have 3 libraries in walking distance of their houses. And so it just changes the conversation and the people that are at the table and the way you can have that conversation in radically different ways. I think using the GIS data also helps you bring different partners to the table at every stage of the conversation. It helps you bring different funding partners to the table, because lots of times funders don't want to or can't engage in programmatic funding, but this is something that you can show has a real impact, is time limited in many ways because you're building the system, and can go to their mission of whatever it is, but is a real project that they can undertake in a meaningful way. And then as you use the GIS data, you can bring in not just more funders, but different state agencies, community-based agencies, as we talked about. And actually, when you have these maps, which can be very pretty, and Trent talked about people geeking out. I get really excited, like I stand up and I bounce around the table, and it's a really great thing. But you can bring in people to the conversation who may have absolutely no data background, because these are so easy to understand when they're not 400 data points. I've seen that slide too. But it really can highlight for folks things that they believe in their heart about their communities, and you can show it in a meaningful way to people with all different levels of sophistication, all different level backgrounds and interest in helping to solve the problems that children and families have, and from different ways to impact the outcomes for their kids. So you can share it with teachers, you can share it with providers, you can share it with parents, you can share it with high-level funders, you can share it with folks at the in community-based agencies, you can share it with planning organizations, right? You can bring in economic development and use that information. So it's just a tool that can unite a variety of perspectives towards the outcomes we're all striving for.
I think, one point to underscore, if this isn't apparent already, this is a little bit messy, and it doesn't always point to a clear answer. And so I think being willing to embrace that a little bit and realize that we're not talking about a single data point here. Those conversations are different. They're often better, but they're hard. And so I think that's important, particularly when you bring together so many different data sets that are actually telling very different individual stories, and then when they come together, it tells, yet again, a very different story than they tell individually. So I think just sort of understanding and appreciating that, and realizing that you're not going to be able to take a single screenshot and get the answer that you might if you were doing a different type of analysis.
And I would just add, in addition to being messy, it's political, and and it's just, you can imagine how explosive that gets because it's real, and it puts in your face current context, but it also puts in your face historical context, and that's not pretty here. So that's just a real thing, but that's part of this kind of adaptive challenge around what are the skills we build around those conversations to be able to engage in them in a productive way that doesn't look away or doesn't make excuses or doesn't just,
Yes, and I will be very transparent. This has been an iterative process, and every time we update, I think I drive our mapping partners crazy because I say, hey, our partner really asked if you can throw this on the map. Yeah. I say, oh, okay, sure. But again, and it makes it more and more complex. We started sort of from a conceptual place. So again, we talk a lot about school readiness. We're in the birth to 5 space. And so, about 15 years ago, Rhode Island Kids Count led what I believe was about a 17-state initiative to develop state-specific indicators around school readiness. And they were organized around this idea of ready families, ready children, ready schools, meaning K-12, and ready communities. And so we tried to organize our 200 data points around that. So for example, you'll see crime data under ready communities. You'll see our 3rd grade reading and math data under ready schools. And I think that has helped make it a little more approachable, but that whole process was informed by conversations with our partners. And as I said earlier, it continues to be informed by those conversations. And in many cases, we've had partners say, hey, this is our data. We put our data on your map. And we've had to decide whether it's relevant to include. But that's part of the reason we developed another tool is there was so much in there that it became overwhelming to the average user. So we developed a tool that has fewer indicators and in fact sort of a composite index variable that we created from sort of 10 key indicators. But that whole process was informed by conversations with stakeholders. Mm-hmm.
I would just add one set of data that we haven't used yet that we should. Is that one of the things GIS will also do is because of the way that Twitter and our phones will geotag basically for taking pictures or uploading content, that this whole idea around working with communities to develop a deeper, kind of more qualitative understanding of experience. We're really excited about the potential for engaging middle and high school age students, for example, on community mapping projects to where kind of beyond what's publicly available, these kind of typical administrative data sets, that we would really consider culture and consider oral histories and landmarks that really are meaningful and to paint a richer picture, and that's one that's way more participatory. And all the functionalities there, it's the orchestrating of getting everybody going, but it's a cool thing.
And I'll just add on, that's something that we have struggled with, and my background is more on the quantitative than the qualitative side, but as Trent said earlier, this is really about mixed methods, and it would be great in my mind if we could. This is also about storytelling, but I think what's missing is that base, right? And so we don't, before kids are 8, have a whole lot of child level data, but finding those stories, those human voices that complement what the map is telling you, I think would make these tools even more powerful. So trying to figure out what that looks like and how they can work together to create an even better tool.
And I will add to that in many cases, in many communities, there's already something existing. So for instance, your Head Start providers all have to do a needs assessment of their community every 3 years. And so they have demographic data that crosses various school catchment areas. They have needs assessment data about which children are homeless and what percentage of children may have disabilities in that community. And so you don't always have to start from scratch. You can find data sets that have been compiled and put together and sit down and have conversations with people to start to tell the story, identify where there are further data gaps, and then use this to fill in. You can also start at the most basic community level and sometimes build up rather than starting at the state level and building across, right? So some of this is about understanding the problem you're trying to solve and drawing the circle in a way that will start to get you there, using the resources that are available to you. If you can't do a statewide GIS map, that's okay. Can you do it for a catchment area for your school most at risk? Can you bring people to the table and have a conversation about what you already know and then backfill with other organizations, right? So it's not always biting off the whole piece, it's figuring out what the chunks are, who already has pieces, forming relationships, and then telling that story in that way.
Thank you, everyone.
I would just add one little piece of this, because I don't think we brought it up, is just, it should also inform how you think about what data you collect moving forward and what you collect at that moment, and kind of what grain size, at what level of geography you're thinking about. If it's in schools, what would be the things we would want to know along with that we would want to.
Thank you everyone for engaging in this conversation with us. I think GIS can be a really powerful tool, and we hope that we've offered some practical advice and some good overviews about conversations. So let's give a big hand to our panel.